Financial Argument. Follow us on YouTube.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with FinanceAndLiberty.com, and back with us today is Jim Willie, editor of the Hattrick Letter found on GoldenJackass.com. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure being on, Elijah. I think we're going to focus on some pretty interesting topics here, and I honestly think we've got the focus of attention in the right places here.
Definitely, and I wanted to first talk about an article you wrote. You recently wrote that QE and ZRIP, zero interest rate policy, are not stimulus agents to the U.S. economy. They are a death sentence. So can you expand a little bit on this?
Sure. We have a situation where the Federal Reserve is stuck. They're stuck because they have to employ the derivative machinery. They don't really have anywhere near adequate demand for Treasury bonds. So they have to put into place a Zimbabwe-style monetary policy where we're printing money to cover our deficits. It's called monetizing the debt. It is probably the most deadly, lethal policy that any central bank can do. And it's being done on the dollar with the global reserve status in the balance. This is absolutely deadly. I call it a death warrant for the dollar. It started in 2012, putting in QE, and quantitative easing makes it sound like it's this exotic and very advanced financial engineering. It's nothing more than unsterilized hypermonetary inflation to monetize a gigantic $1 trillion annual deficit. This is deadly ground. People think that the derivatives, with all the interest rate swap machinery and credit defaults, and I call it the whirling dervish that spins around so fast that it deludes people and deceives people into thinking that it actually has mass to serve as a foundation for the global banking system. It does not. It's all a ruse. It's fake. We've got a desperate situation right now. The U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. So we're counterfeiting money for the foundation of the banking system asset core. This is a grotesque undermining process. We're counting to enable U.S. economic imports. And some of the blockage and the impasses that we see at the ports with big container vessels not coming in, I believe what we've got here is a hidden strike against the U.S. dollar. They don't want treasury bills in payment. They want real money. We're printing money. They don't want the printed money because they realize it's fake. We've got counterfeiting to cover the U.S. government deficit that's really no different than what Zimbabwe did. And it's stuck at $1 trillion a year. We've got counterfeiting to finance wars, often against allies who are buying treasury bonds in the past. But now we have a new element where war is largely being financed by narcotics funds. That's what the ISIS and Syria battlefront is all about. There's a heavy-handed banking policy across the globe. The U.S. Department of Treasury issues all kinds of rules and regulations, and what they're saying now with like FATCA is that, well, if you have a dollar-based account, we're in charge of dollar policy. So if you're in Panama or you're in Hong Kong, you have to comply with the U.S. government rules because otherwise we won't make money move toward your banking system in dollar form. So it's very heavy-handed, and the backlash is producing a global revolt and rebellion, and if not a boycott against the dollar and the entire U.S. government finance. No longer the world feels trapped, though, now. No longer, because they're pursuing alternatives and other options. And the biggest one, Elijah, is something that about 3 or 4 weeks ago had successful live tests. It's a Chinese interbank payment system. It's called CHIPS, CIPS, and it acts as an alternative to the dollar-based SWIFT bank-to-bank transaction system. This is gigantic news. The Eastern world and the emerging market satellites for the East, they have a dollar alternative for banking use, bank to bank. And what I'm hearing is they're trying to tie in now with the sovereign bond market and the Forex currency market with this bank-to-bank system. It passed the live test for bank-to-bank. Now I think they're trying to do live tests for tying in with financial markets of bonds and currencies. This is huge because what it means is the dollar can be kicked to the curb for 60 to 70% or 50% of global commerce. This is enormous, and I think it's all spawned from QE, the African-style monetary policy put on 4 years ago to manage the crisis of an uncontrollable U.S. government deficit of $1 trillion a year and an uncontrollable situation where foreign countries are dumping treasuries. They have to soak them up. So they print money and soak them up. This is a tremendously dangerous situation, and it is very much an end game. This cannot continue for another 2 or 3 years. No way. This is end game, Elijah.
Now, I was wondering, did you want to discuss a little bit about how recent money velocity has proven that QE and ZIRP have been utter failures?
Sure. You know, if you stimulate something, you expect it to move faster, right? You know, you stimulate a son by saying, I'll give you $10 if you mow that lawn. You see the boy getting off the couch. You see movement. If you want to stimulate a horse, you kick it in the side with your spurs or whatever. And, you know, some people think it's cruel, but they got a very thick hide. And what do you get? You get more movement from the horse. He starts to gallop. If you stimulate the U.S. economy, you'd expect to see more movement of money in commerce. And there's a measure for that. It's called money velocity. And basically what they do is they calculate the entire nominal amount, meaning unadjusted, for movement within the economy, like gross domestic product, and they divide it by how much money there is out there, and what you get is essentially, you know, in layman's terms, the number of round trips per dollar within the economy in a given year. And if you have a lot of good activity, you see a lot of movement. In other words, you follow the dollar. I don't know if you ever have gone to, followgeorge.com or whatever they call it. It's looking at a dollar bill, and they put the serial number on it, and you can see its movement around the country. Well, imagine that on a bigger scale. You're looking to count how many times a certain dollar makes a complete round trip in the economy. And that's a very weird concept, but on a literal basis. But just divide the whole amount of activity by the whole amount of dollars, and that is the money velocity. And in the past, when they lowered interest rates, there'd be more business investment. Companies would say, well, gee, if they're going to lower the interest rate by 2 or 3%, we're going to take advantage of that and do some business expansion. We're going to buy some equipment. We're going to buy some plant, buy an office building, hire people, buy equipment, buy computers, buy telephones, buy some optic lines. That's activity. And that's usually spawned by lower interest rates. Well, in the last 6 years since Lehman, the predominant amount of activity has been in emerging market nations, not in the United States. U.S.-based companies have openly stated we're not expanding. We have no plans to do a capital investment on an increased basis in the United States, but we are in the Pacific Rim, or we are in Pakistan, or we are in India, or we are elsewhere, Mexico, in Brazil. So it's been like a strike against the U.S. Too much regulation, too much environmental control, too many expected fringe benefits and health benefits. They don't want to have anything to do with Obamacare. Obamacare is a gigantic failure and deterrent for any new business activity in the United States. All right, so if you look at a chart of money velocity over the last several years, and the Federal Reserve, St. Louis, they maintain these databases and charts very effectively. I think that the smartest of all the Federal Reserve analysts operate out of St. Louis. You see a 40% decline in the money velocity just since Lehman. So what are we doing? Where's the stimulus? It's like, okay, you're stimulating something, but the guy's still on the couch. The guy fell off the couch, and he's now on the floor. There's no stimulus. So where is the stimulus? Well, if there was any, and it probably was for a while, it was in the financial markets with the bond markets, mortgage bonds and treasury bonds and junk bonds. When you see a lot of movement in treasuries, everybody tends to think, well, the junk bond sector is a good opportunity now because of, distress in the system being relieved. Well, now you start to see huge distress in the junk bond market, and you're starting to see fractures and fault lines in the treasury bonds, Elijah. This is getting to be extremely dangerous with respect to, say, primary dealers. Now, just for primary dealers, just think of a group of 10 or 12 or 15 banks that have a desk that follow orders from the Federal Reserve to get things done and clean up things. Well, they have to act, those primary dealers, they have to act as kind of a mirror image of the derivatives that are artificially creating enormous treasury bond demand for the 10-year bond. They must clean it up and make sure that it's all working. Well, they're under tremendous distress because they can't. There's too much movement, and there's not enough legitimate bond market activity. If you've got the Fed in there that's acting as a buyer of last resort, the legitimate buyers and investors vanish because they figure, well, what's the bother? You already got the big hand in there doing the buying. So it destroys slowly the market. Here we are 4 years later after QE is put in. Lots of lies and lots of details and, QE 1, 2, Operation Twist, QE 3, whatever. We now have the bond market breaking. You've got too much of a vanishing act of legitimate buyers. This is very, very dangerous. We do not have stimulus even now in the bond market, in the financial sector. QE has wrecked the movement of funds even in the financial market. They say the Fed is the buyer of last resort. Well, now it's becoming the buyer of primary resort even in the stock market. The primary bond deals, I should get back to them because they're not able to provide the mirror image activity for cleaning up after derivative action, the artificial action. And there's some direct evidence that it's not working and they can't get things done. And that has to do with the statistic called failures to deliver on treasuries. Now, a lot of false information, propaganda has come out, Elijah, regarding failures to deliver. We are told that, there's so much demand for treasury bonds that we just have a hard time delivering on them 2 to 3 days later in legitimate fashion. No, it's a bunch of bullshit. There's so much derivative machinery creating artificial demand that the cleanup process to match reality in the bond market with the artificial nonsense in the derivative machinery arena, there's so much mismatch and lag time and overwhelmed volume that you're seeing enormous amounts to the tune of $25 billion a day in failures to deliver on Treasury bonds. It's not evidence of a brisk market. It's evidence of a broken market and a derivative arena that has become too dominant and cannot match with reality. We're in breakdown mode, Elijah. This is breakdown. The dollar is breaking before our eyes, loaded with lies on its actual breakdown. We've never seen anything like this in the history of modern mankind.
Now, I'd like to discuss a little bit about, you're saying we're seeing this breakdown of the dollar, and you also talked about in a recent article that we're just seeing things happening quicker and quicker. You talked about what you call the Great Quickening. Did you want to give our viewers an update on why you believe we are witnessing what you call the Great Quickening?
Yes, I wrote an article about 3 weeks ago, and it was a very different kind of a format that I used. I just put a giant category, and I listed in one-liners a dozen events. Then another category, another dozen events. Another category, another 8 events. We have, in the past, if you had looked at this list in, say, 2005 or 2006, you wouldn't be able to put even 10% of this type of list together. The events just were nowhere near as numerous, nowhere near as important, nowhere near as comprehensive as part of the global revolt against the dollar. And you know, I look at these events, and then I try to match up with what you see in, say, Wall Street Journal or the New York Times business section. They don't cover a quarter of them. There are enormously important events taking place right now, and we don't even have coverage in the main press in the United States. They're not doing their jobs. They're not telling us what's going on. I had to adjust something on my head. They're not even remotely competent financial journals anymore. So what are these important events? Well, the East is going into a de-dollarization mode. The Russians and Chinese are doing all their oil trade outside the dollar. It won't be long before the Saudis announce that they will do a significant amount of RMB, Chinese currency-based trade, with the Chinese. In other words, the Chinese won't use the dollar to buy Saudi oil. There are all kinds of new non-U.S. dollar platforms in construction. They're not just construction anymore. They're being funded, they're being tested, they're being used. We get like for Langley and the Soros Foundation. They're paying for the Syrian refugees to enter Europe. Why? To mess up their society, to increase the crime rate, to bring about more rape and assaults and robberies, and to mess up their society. Okay, well, gee, that seems to be going well. Angela Merkel is trying to defend it, saying to her people in the German population, give the refugee problem more time to work itself out. In other words, give it more time to contaminate our whole country. This is part of the quickening. The quickening. In the meantime, you have Russia and China working on their Silk Road and Belt, as they call it. I like to call it the Eurasian Trade Zone. It's also known as the Eurasian Economic Union. So much is going on. If for those who like to think in terms of biblical framework, remember we've got the 7 bowls of water. I'm sorry, 7 bowls to ruin the earth. I'd like to mention several candidates for the 7 bowls. The chemtrails are messing up the air. The fracking by Halliburton is messing up the water tables. The GMO virus preparation for seeds and all this by Monsanto is messing up the food. QE and the Federal Reserve and all their satellite central banks are messing up the money. The Center for Disease Control and Fort Detrick Bioweapons Laboratory are messing up all the vaccines by lacing them with the actual viruses. Now you've got the human refugees infecting Europe. And by the way, for those Americans who would like to know a little more about what's going on, United Parcel Service, UPS, is now doing middle-of-the-night shipments of human garbage refugees, and they're landing now in New Orleans, where they're dumping 10,000. They do not have proper identification. They do not satisfy proper customs requirements, immigration requirements, or any requirements. And the 7th bowl, it's the Halliburton dumping of radioactive substances 100 miles off the coast of California and blaming it on Fukushima, the dumping and ruination of the oceans. So air, water, food, money, vaccines, society, and the oceans. Those are potentially 7 bowls in a biblical sense. And, let's not leave out the cancer cures. We had some murders that took place in September. I regard this as part of the quickening because they're being revealed. You had about 8 to 12 doctors, mostly in the southeast United States, who were about to come forward to explain that they've had successful cancer cures, even of advanced, horrible cases of cancer, and all the doctors were murdered. And it got in the news. And I happen to know somebody in Panama whose sister is a medical technician and knew one of the killed doctors. The doctors were about to go to a conference and explain their cure for cancer and what they've researched to understand the contents of vaccines to be immune system suppressants. Part of what's in the vaccines across many types is something to suppress the human immune system. They also managed to shut down the attackers, those who killed the doctors. They managed to shut down a plant in Europe that was producing the substance. It's a substance to put your antibodies into hyperdrive. And they shut down that, and you won't find the murders in the main U.S. press or the Western press. They actually poisoned a lot of doctors in a European conference where this was the main theme. Oh, just had a bad day. The pork was bad or the fish was bad. Yeah, it's so easy to come up with the stories that the public believes. So we got a quickening. The central bank activity, this is really interesting. Most of them are amplifying toward infinite volume, like the United States Fed and the Bank of Japan, their central bank, and European central bank. But a lot of other minor secondary central banks are breaking ranks, Elijah, and we no longer have a case where we can say all the central banks are pretty much doing the same thing. They're all aligned. They're not anymore. They're not.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about a topic that you had mentioned a little bit earlier. You were talking about precious metal markets, and you were saying that we're seeing massive demand for gold and silver amidst the shutdown of mining projects. Now, I talked with you about this last month. I guess, did you want to just give us an update on how the precious metal markets have progressed in the last month, and how do you see precious metals comparing to other asset groups?
I saw a very interesting chart. It had about 10 different things on it, 10 different asset groups on it, and most of them were heading down. I mean, 8 or 9 of them were heading down, and only one was going up, and that was gold and silver. It's the best performing asset class this year in 2016, and we've only passed the first quarter, 3 months completed. If you look at the multi-year chart, you see a downtrend in gold and silver, and in the last year or so, you saw some movement down, but it was basically a leveling off. All that has been reversed. All the downtrend lines have been smashed with movement up, both gold and silver. In fact, it got so severe that there are a couple of charts. On the daily charts, they tend to look at the 50-day versus the 200-day. And on the weekly chart, there's a tendency, it's a common practice among technical analysts, traders, and researchers who put out reports that are commonly read and bought. For the weekly, it's a 20-week moving average versus the 50-week moving average. And I pay a lot of attention to this myself. And what I noticed was back in January and February, we had some major developments in the gold price where the 20-week moving average, which is more faster moving and more unstable, and it just makes bigger movements than the 50 because it's averaging more things. The 20-week moving average moved above the 50-week moving average. That's called a crossover, a bullish crossover. We hadn't seen anything like that in 5 years, so I paid attention to that. Okay, this is very new. Now we're seeing the same thing happen with the silver market. It's a little bit lagged behind gold. Gold is now making it's consolidating. It's not retreating. It's just absorbing and digesting its gains. What we saw in January, Elijah, was the gold price moving up in Canadian dollar terms, in euro terms, in yen terms, but not so much in the dollar. Now we're seeing it confirmed in the dollar. This is very big news. It's getting recognized, too. And I have a saying that, and I'm not original with this at all. It's a saying that I've latched onto. When you see such moves as this, it means that the biggest of the players have changed. This chart hasn't looked so good in 5 years. From 2012 to 2014 and 15, I didn't really feature too many gold charts in the Hat Trick newsletter. I was focusing on factors that would change the gold market. Factors like the dollar death, platforms that don't use the dollar, non-dollar platforms, the petrodollar story, the stealing of the Saudi gold, throwing them under the bus, central bank activity, the movement and stealing of gold like in Ukraine and Libya. I was focusing on that. Now you can actually say the gold chart looks different now. It has turned massively bullish, and it's getting recognized. It not only is an event on the chart, but you can point to a lot of fundamentals and say that they've created a lot of non-dollar platforms. In particular, the most important is not the infrastructure bank, AIIB. No, the most important is the alternative to SWIFT, the CHIPS, Chinese interbank payment system. Banks now have the opportunity to work around sanctions. We've abused the sanctions. We've used the SWIFT weapon the SWIFT feature, the SWIFT codes as a weapon against Iran for 3 years and against Ukraine and Russia for 2 years, principally Russia. We've abused it. We control the SWIFT system, and we've abused it because it has a dollar name on it. Well, now the Chinese have something with an RMB name on it. They're going to boycott the dollar. This is major, major stuff, and it's reflected in the gold price. The Europeans have a saying, Americans will do all the wrong things, but eventually they'll make the right decision. Okay. Regarding the insolvency of the banking system, regarding the, what should I call it? The default-prone U.S. Treasury bond, we've done all the wrong things. We've had war to defend the dollar. We have interest rate derivatives to defend and produce Treasury bond demand. We have basically an enormous counterfeiting trillion-dollar operation with the blessing of the U.S. government. We have theft of foreign Treasury bonds. All this activity is part of the quickening, but it's also part of the upcoming actual solution, and that is the gold standard coming back. The reset, global currency reset, is a misnomer, false name. The reset is the reinstallation, the return of the gold standard. It's going to start, Elijah, I've said this before a few times, it's going to start with trade. And now if the CHIPS alternative to SWIFT is ready by China, they've got the trade mechanisms for payment ready to avoid the dollar. The next thing after that is banking reserves. They're going to be dumping treasuries and buying gold. This has two different purposes. One is that it sets the gold standard in the banks, but it also allows the banks to buy truckloads of gold and then give the signal to the Chinese, we're ready for your doubling of the gold price. That's coming. I don't know when. Sure would be nice if it were this calendar year, but we always seem to have another war that Washington can offer. We always seem to have another device by the central banks that pollute the system. So the gold chart, the silver chart, they're consolidating. I think silver's gonna surprise first. I have my own little saying that gold fights the political battles and breaks down the doors, knocks down the castle gates. And silver just flies through on a white horse. Gold opens the door for silver. There's some that actually say, well, this gold rally is not real. It's not being confirmed by silver. Well, silver got off its back very effectively. And I think it's going to be making bigger gains than gold. So it's interesting to watch the relative strength. Gold has it. Compare it to the stock market, the bond market, junk bond market, energy credit portfolio market, oil price. Compare it to a lot of things, even like, say, industrial price of copper, industrial price of coal. Gold wins, and now we're finally getting the good attention, Elijah.
I wanted to move now to a topic that you've discussed before. You said that with Iran joining the Eurasian trade zone, this represents three great empires of history working together in somewhat an awakening process. So what do you see the effect on the global economy and financial structures being of Iran joining the Eurasian trade zone?
In a simple response, it means you've got a three-way nucleus, three-part nucleus for the eastern nations of the world banding together to actually make a difference and to force a paradigm shift. For those who don't really know what paradigm shift means, just think of it as the model for the global financial structure changing. Paradigm means model. So paradigm shift means the East is going to start calling the shots, making big changes to the system. I like to do a little preliminary story. I'll try to be quick. The Soviet Union, the entire Soviet Union, you could actually make the argument, was the framework of a gold heist. Baron Rothschild, way back around 1900, 1905, funded the Bolshevik Revolution and got everybody in the Romanov family nervous as hell. And then he convinced the Tsar, king, Tsar, it's the same root as Caesar and Kaiser in German. He got the Tsar to put the gold in safekeeping in London and Paris. Then they killed him. So you set up the Bolshevik Revolution. You make the Tsar nervous as hell. You get him to lease the gold to Paris and London. Then you have him killed. Then you bring in your other purchased ideologues of Lenin and Marx, and you start taking over the Russian Empire, and you make it a Soviet Union. Fast forward 80 years, and Putin wants his gold back. Is Putin a bad guy for wanting repatriation of the Tsarist gold, which might have been on the order of 15,000 tons, maybe twice as much as Fort Knox? Russia was an empire back then. Russia is awakening. That's my point. Now go to China. Very few people know that Mao Zedong was a member of the Skull and Bones, a secret society of Yale University. The elite Satanists. So they convinced China to become a communist nation, offered a lot of benefits to the Chinese leaders, and the Great Dragon was put in a deep freeze. Well, you don't fast forward 80 years, you fast forward 60 years, and you get the awakening with, say, most favored nation status to China. At the same time, Hong Kong turned over to Chinese control. They didn't change much anything in Hong Kong. They're using it as a model. Okay, awakening of the great Chinese empire. Now let's turn to Persia, otherwise known as Iran. Back in 1950, the U.S. threw out Mossadegh, and they installed the Shah. The Shah of Iran was one of the biggest pieces of human garbage ever to sit on a throne. He used the Savak security agents to go across Europe and murder Iranians all across Europe, in particular Germany and France. Then you had suddenly in 1980, timed with the Iran, hostage case in Tehran, you had the Ayatollah Khomeini come out of where to lead the Islamic Revolution in Persia? He came out of France. Why was France so friendly to him? I think a lot of this is efforts to put the old Eastern empires in the deep freeze, put them to sleep, anesthetize them. And now the Persian Empire is awakening as they've convinced China to assist them to put aside the sanctions, have the Iran nuclear talks, and have recognition that most of the threat that Israel bandied about in their propaganda was pure nonsense. Okay, so three former great empires are awakening, Elijah. They're coordinating their time frame. They're working together. You got some big projects now with Chinese funding inside Iran. You got some other Russian projects involved. The Iranians are very heavily involved in buying Russian weapons and missiles. They bought Sunburn missiles. The U.S. will not attack and rape and pillage Iran like they did Iraq, because Iran purchased a lot of really advanced Sunburn missiles. And if U.S. attacks Iran, Iran will sink the U.S. naval fleet in the Persian Gulf. And that could be why the Persian Gulf no longer has a U.S. Navy presence for the first time in 40 years. So a lot going on here. I'm encouraged by Russia, China, and Iran working together. They're going to coordinate things with Pakistan and India. They're going to coordinate things with the former Soviet republics. They're going to get, I think, Germany on board. They're going to get Saudi Arabia on board. They're going to start chipping away at the European core, Elijah. This is very interesting, very exciting, full of intrigue. But if you try to reflect it on what's it going to mean for financial markets and things we care about, it's going to mean a faster acceleration away from the dollar. They're not going to use the dollar. China, Russia, Persia, they're not going to use the dollar. They already don't use the dollar much. And they love gold. They want to install the gold standard. I don't think you can call any foreign country, regime, or empire terrorist if they push the gold standard. Any nation that continues the dollar standard, I believe, is loaded with terrorism. Not just a financial type, but the staged events like in Paris and Belgium. Very few people are aware. The Israeli Mossad had 100% control and maintenance of the Belgian airport. So either they are extremely incompetent to have a terrorist event under their noses, or they were in charge of it. I tend to believe 95% toward the latter, they were in charge of it, 5% the former, that it was just an infiltration, because the Israeli Mossad has a reputation of being the most expert in the world. They're so expert that for the last 20 years, the Saudi royals have hired the Israeli Mossad for personal security. Little known fact, yes, the Saudis hire Israel for their own elite security. So, was Belgium an ISIS attack? Well, maybe. Was it an attack by the Turkish cooperation within the guerrillas of ISIS? Maybe. With the door opened by the Israeli Mossad. And advance warning given to the Belgian government security little apparatus, where they stood down, got out of the way. We got staged terrorism by the dollar proponents. Okay, that's my speech on the three-sided Eurasian trade zone with the old empire's awakening, Elijah.
Well, before we let you go, I wanted to just touch on one last subject. I wanted to talk a little bit about the BRICS nations. You've talked about how the BRICS nations are showing evidence of falling apart in recent months. So what do you see are the weak points?
The weak points are the oil-based economies within the BRICS. And bear in mind that Mexico and Venezuela are not BRICS core members, but Brazil is. Brazil's got a major problem in that Petrobras, their national state-owned oil company, is riddled with corruption, riddled with debt, riddled with inefficiencies from poor investment. You know, when you're making sweetheart loans to politicians and executives, and when you're making bribes to politicians, and you're making all kinds of bad decisions with people in high positions within Petrobras, you ruin the company. And that's what Chavez did in Venezuela. And, you know, put it on a new level of self-destruction, you find out what Pemex did in Mexico. I mean, one of my favorite stories in Mexico is they murder a bunch of Pemex people, take their uniforms, try to sew the bullet holes and wash out the blood stains, and they don't do a really good job. So they use the same uniforms, they use the same stolen trucks, they use the same stolen pipe equipment and materials, and they actually build what appears to be an extension to the Pemex pipelines when it's done by the drug cartel with all the stolen equipment and uniforms. Something like 10 to 15% of all Pemex oil is stolen by the cartels with what appears to be official Pemex diversions. Well, they even have signs saying Pemex, do not enter, for the Pemex extensions. Anyway, let's focus on Brazil here. They've got extreme problems with Petrobras. They've got debt payments due real soon. They luckily, like Venezuela, just made some payments, but they've got some others coming later this year, just like Venezuela, that they're going to have a lot of trouble with. And I'm hearing that China is coming in there as, riding the white horse, and they're going to offer a lot of money. They're going to cover a lot of debt, but they're going to look for some asset acquisitions. And I wouldn't be surprised at all in 2 or 3 years if China is in charge of Venezuela's oil operations. I don't know about that in Brazil, where it's more complicated. They've got the salts. The salts are enormous oil deposits under a layer of ocean salt. And the Brazilians have resisted for quite a while in allowing foreign companies, like Dutch Shell or Exxon or Rosneft from Russia. The obstructions have been in there steadily for foreign acquisition or investment stakes is a better term. Like Rosneft would come in and say, we're going to buy an 18% investment stake and slap down several $1 billion. And we're going to be working and building some of the platforms. And Brazil doesn't have so much in their own obligation for putting up money, putting up materials, putting up manpower. Okay, that's very important. The Brazilians are caught between a rock and a hard place, caught between a salt layer and a hard place. I'm sorry, I'm getting silly. They're caught between an ocean rock and the sea salts layer. And they have to make some concessions. But something very interesting is going on in Brazil behind the scenes. 2 years ago, a small airplane crash took place, and it was blamed on Langley, where a very strong candidate, alternative to Dilma Rousseff, was, making waves. He looked like a really good leader, and he wasn't a socialist clown. His name was Campo. Well, Campo died. I think Campo was murdered. The U.S. really doesn't like effective leaders to come forward. They prefer to kill them. And being the exceptional nation, isn't it within the rights of Washington to murder foreign heads of state and foreign candidates to become heads of state? They're the exceptional nation. Exceptional in its terrorism, exceptional in its state-level assassinations. That might include Hugo Chavez. Don't know. Hard to say. So what we've got now is former President Lula da Silva of Brazil being charged with corruption in the Petrobras, national oil company scandals. And on the side, Dilma Rousseff is also being accused in other corruption cases. So what Dilma did was a very clever move of assign Lula da Silva, the former president, to become their equivalent of the White House chief of staff, the executive ombudsman for the Brazilian government. Very interesting move because it has a consequence that no corruption charges could proceed against Lula unless they come from the Supreme Court. I'm told that all the anti-corruption movement within Brazil is being organized by the Western elites because they want to depose the BRICS leaders and install Western puppets. So the move by Dilma to put Lula as White House chief of staff equivalent was a brilliant move that blocked the way. Now you've got demonstrations by the people in Brazil all over the place. Some of them are calling for Lula's head. Some are calling for Dilma's head. But I don't think they're too aware that this is a cleanup movement paid for by Western elite organizations to take control of Brazil and exit the BRICS. Okay, I believe that the BRICS nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa had better put it in higher gear. Get their movement toward the CHIPS payment system between banks, get it in a higher gear. Get the reload of gold in their banks into a higher gear. Get their refusal of the dollar in trade payments in a higher gear. And get a BRICS gold currency in a higher gear, because they're running out of time on both the corruption and the debt default sides. It's getting very interesting, and we got another weird timeline here. In July and August, I think it's August. It's August. We have the Summer Olympics in Brazil and Rio. They better get things straightened out. You don't want to have big marches, big demonstrations with 1 million people in the street calling for deposing Dilma, the president, while the Olympics are going on. Okay, this is what I think the elites are going to try to do. They're going to try to have violent demonstrations and overthrow attempts and really nasty revolt going on in Rio while the Olympics are going on, because there's a lot of television crews covering the sports venues. So, wow. India is also in trouble. India's got big currency decline trouble. They got huge gold imports because their currency's in trouble, which is a vicious feedback loop. The imports for gold cause big balance of payments problems, cause the currency to go down, cause price inflation to hit the economy, cause more motivation to buy more gold, and repeat the cycle. And they're making many, many rules and restrictions within India, and I don't think they're making too many good decisions. They're trying to get monetization of temple gold in India right now, and they managed to get 3 million tons of gold out of the temples, but the temples might have 5 or 6 times as much of that. So it's a very, very tiny success story for the elites. And by the way, if you're an Indian businessman listening to this and you put forth your business's gold, or you're a powerful family household, and you put forth some of your gold, sent it to the banks and got your CD for it with some interest, you ain't never going to see your gold again. Because it's a Western elite plot to get the gold out of the temples and the households. Indian households have between 15 and 20,000 tons of gold. They have twice what was in Fort Knox. And it's largely stayed out of their banking system. It's not monetized. That's the phrase used. Well, the Indian government, with instructions from Washington and Brussels, are trying to curry favor and get that temple gold into the system so they can steal it. It's what the Western nations do. War, bond fraud, and gold thefts.
All right. Well, Jim, Willie, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers quickly, where they can find you and any last thoughts you had?
Yeah, I don't have any more last thoughts. We covered a lot of really good ground here. I appreciate your guideline for the topics, Elijah. Nice job, and they're all very important areas and hot buttons, as I call them. I cover a lot of this in the hat trick letter. Well, you're welcome. I cover this in the hat trick letter. If you go to www.goldenjackass.com, no hyphens in there, no fancy stuff, you will see on the public page a lot of links for radio shows. I call them radio shows. They're podcasts. I don't care what you call them. They're online interviews that are something you can listen to with a link. Okay. I call them radio shows. Got a lot of radio shows, and I just now am having the 12th anniversary for the Hat Trick Letter. There are a number of public articles. In past years, I can honestly say that in 04, 05, 06, 07, 8, and 9, I wrote around 40 public articles a year. It was almost one every week. I don't do that anymore, partly because I enjoy radio shows a lot more, and partly because I'm getting a lot of invitations because of correct forecasts. So the radio shows, they're a nice little medallion around my neck for a good job, and I like that. They're fun. And let's face it, there are a lot of people out there who don't have time to sit down or inclination to sit down. Maybe they're just mentally tired from going to work and earning a living, and when they come home, they just want to sit back and listen to a radio show for 40 minutes or whatever in 2 segments. All right, so the Hat Trick Letter is the paid publication. Every month it has, almost every month, it has 2 different reports. It's the Global Money War Report, higher level items, and the other one is the Gold and Currency Report for lower level items, and they're all important. So ground level and upper level topics, both covered. It's a labor of love, Elijah. I love this work. It's the favorite work I've ever done in my career since getting out of graduate school in 1980. But I will admit, this is tense. This is constant stress ever since Lehman. When Lehman happened, it was an event like a climax. Finally, we have a breakdown of the system. And now what I think we're working our way toward is a systemic Lehman event. Lehman was largely focused on the mortgage bonds and related derivatives. I don't want to get into detail, but there are a lot of leveraged and exotic garbage in the financial engineering that Sir Alan Greenspan was so impressed by. He was an architect of failure. So now since Lehman in 2008, we've fixed nothing. We've tried to fix nothing. We refuse to go on the gold standard. We refuse to liquidate the big banks. We refuse to do anything right, and we're resorting to war and QE to infinity and 0% forever, getting a lot of aid from other central banks. We're not doing anything right toward a solution, and that's why the Asians, the Easterners, the emerging markets, the BRICS, that's why they're banding together to do the right thing of bring back the gold standard, first in trade, then in banking, finally in currencies. So go to goldenjackass.com, bounce around, learn some stuff, get up to speed and stuff. If you're new, and sign up for the Hat Trick Letter. You will not be disappointed. I get 2 compliments that I love to hear. I was away for a while after a past subscription. I never should have left. And the other one is that I've been resorting to your interviews exclusively, and I never thought to sign up, but I did, and now I'm kicking myself. So I just got a compliment about 3 or 4 days ago that I've been listening just to your radio interviews, and I finally signed up, and I'm in that second group, Jim. Count me in. I wish I'd signed up a long time ago. So sign up for the Hat Trick Letter. You won't be disappointed. Thanks for having me on, Elijah. And again, it's been interesting. This nightmare will not stop until the dollar is replaced and the gold standard comes back.
This video was brought to you in part by ReluctantPreppers.com. Click here to watch Reluctant Prepper's latest interview with Dr. Paul Byrne, MD. How aware and prepared are you really for this? Your loved one becomes unconscious and suddenly you find yourself pressured to consent to organ donation. But what the experts are not telling you is that organs only come from living donors who are dissected alive without anesthesia. Pioneering inventor of the Preemie ICU and the Preemie blood pressure systems and founder of the field of neonatology, Dr. Paul Byrne, MD, joins Reluctant Preppers to draw back the curtain and expose the medical industrial government collusion that will set your heart pounding and send you running to warn your loved ones. This one is not to be missed, and share it with everyone you care about.